was almost thrown in front of a train. During my first trip in South America, I bumped into a bunch of guys who had guns. I was almost killed. Most human beings for me were a threat. I would always be on my guard, ready to attack or defend myself, stressed out, ready to snap at any moment. All those behaviors and reactions were totally out of control for me. So I was a reflex machine. After 2 episodes of cancer, I realized that it didn't make any sense anymore for me to live my life the way I was living it. I found myself very aggressive with people. Where science has led to some progress is essentially behavioral neuroscience. So there's been a number of techniques, approaches that have been developed that we found can reduce stress, can reduce anxiety.
Consciousness and Insights from a Neuroscientist with Professor Pierre Guertin. We'll discuss his new book and explore current neuroscience behind consciousness. Please subscribe. I hope you enjoy.
Hey everybody, welcome to Bernie Chats. We're here with Dr. Pierre Guertin, neuroscientist. He's written a few books and recently launched a new book on dealing with fear and explains some of his experiences and goes into the neurological aspects of that. He's also been a personal friend for a number of years. We've shared some interesting experiences like skydiving and traveling around Europe. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, Pierre. Thanks for agreeing to do this.
Thanks for having me, Bernie.
Would you like to start off by maybe expanding a little bit on your background, and then we'll get into the book, and then I have a list of questions that I've sourced from listeners.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm a neuroscientist, so I obtained a bachelor degree in phys ed to get started at the University of Montreal. Then I did a master degree at the University of Quebec in neurophysiology. I did a PhD degree in neurophysiology as well, in motor control and restoration of unconsciously controlled motor behaviors.
So now you've written a new book.
That's my 4th book. This one, it describes part of my life associated with problems that I've had that have kept me away from being relatively conscious about my behaviors, about a number of things that have happened to me, created fears of other human beings and psychological pain. Through a number of other experiences, mainly diseases, I find ways to overcome those psychological problems to, in the end, increase my level of relative consciousness.
Great.
Let's put it this way.
So I had the pleasure of reading a middle to final draft. My description of it, I guess, would be that you go through some of your experiences in life and how fear and a lack of consciousness played into that and dissect it from a neurophysiological point of view. I think we all deal with fears. I mean, it's part of the human condition, isn't it, to deal with fear?
Yeah, definitely.
You know,
yeah.
That's why we have the sympathetic nervous system, right?
Yep.
In this case, we have somebody who has the neurophysiological background to dissect it. And you're being vulnerable and explaining some of your fears, understanding how we deal with them, I think is a key part or a very important part of developing a strategy to deal with them, right?
Mm-hmm. If we talk about fear, we have to realize that physical fear, which is the one associated with the sympathetic nervous system,
right,
is not at all the same as the psychological fear system. Actually, psychological fear is something we don't know much about the neurophysiological basis.
Maybe start off with providing us with a broad overview of what is neuroscience. And that's a question from Guertin.
Neuroscience is a field that belongs to the larger field that is the life science or the life sciences. So it's one of them. So among the life sciences, you may find the biochemistry, molecular endocrinology, biophysics, microbiology, anatomy, physiology. So those are all disciplines or research areas that belong to the life sciences. And neuroscience is one of them, but it's the only one that focuses specifically and entirely on question about the nervous system. So the nervous system Just a reminder, it's composed of the brain and the spinal cord. That's the central nervous system. And you have the nerves that establish connections between the central nervous system and the organs, including muscles or the guts and things like that. So those are called the peripheral nerves or the peripheral nervous system. So all of those are things that neuroscientists work on because there's a lot to learn about, not necessarily the gross anatomy of the nervous system, but we're more into the details of different pathologies or even physiologically how things are working. There's much to do. There's a lot to do. So that's what neuroscience is compared with the other life sciences. When I first started to get interested in topics associated more with consciousness rather than unconsciousness, because most of my career has been as focused on trying to understand unconsciously mediated motor behaviors. So for instance, in spinal cord injured people, we found drugs that can restore involuntary walking episodes. So that was one part of my research, but I now wanted to get more into consciousness-driven or mediated behaviors, but behaviors meaning also everything we think, everything we say, and all of behaviors that we can have throughout the day. My first problem when I got into that new research program for me was the question of semantic, actually. The word consciousness is not poorly defined. There are just so many different definitions. So actually, I was thinking of asking you, Bernie, what does consciousness mean for you? Just as an example.
In this current contemporary way of describing it, now I would say consciousness to me is being aware of what my body and mind are doing, and then also the actions that are being taken in conjunction with that. And being aware and in the moment. To me, that's what I would say is consciousness. Whereas before this contemporary way of using the term, I would have said simply not being unconscious.
Yeah, those are two very good definitions that are used actually by different groups of people. So your second definition, so everything that is not unconscious, is very close to what anesthesiologists will use as a definition. So if you're not unconscious, you're automatically conscious for them. So of course, they are interested in putting people asleep for surgery or something like that. So for them, they're not talking about higher consciousness level or the kind of consciousness you can stimulate by meditation and all that. For them, it has a totally different meaning. If you ask also another group of people like teenagers, what is consciousness? They will automatically think about self-consciousness or self-awareness. And for them, it means more being shy and worrying about what other people think.
Right.
So again, that's another definition that is used by a certain group of people.
And that's probably ties into the term self-conscious.
Yeah. Also, if we think as psychiatrists, again, that's another definition they'll be using. For them, they don't refer that often to consciousness per se, but they will think more about self-consciousness and problem associated with schizophrenia. So if you recognize that you're in you, or if you cannot recognize that you are in you, then you may be perhaps in two other people at the same time in your head. So the personality problems. So for them, again, that's a slightly different definition. So for researchers, there are an increasing number of neuroscientists who are interested in consciousness and the neurological basis of consciousness. The main problem they encounter is definitions. What does it mean? And because if you don't know exactly what you're talking about, what it means, what are the limits of your definition, then how can you poke into the brain mechanism underlying it? So it's very, it's a semantic problem to get started with.
Is there a better term then?
I came up with a definition that suits the type of research I do. Sure. If we look at the definition of John Kabat-Zinn, He came up with something that is not that dissimilar, but is simpler. But it's essentially about being in the present moment without being judgmental about what's happening, and trying to sense as many things as possible about your body and external stimuli. It's more or less something like that. There are so many definitions. It's a big problem.
Makes sense, especially if you have a team, because you all have to be on the same page. So therefore, definitions are very important.
Exactly.
And the definition in your mind, then you can forge ahead, right?
Yep.
But if your team members have a different definition in their heads, then you could find yourself in misalignment.
Exactly. Even for reading articles, either in popular magazines or scientific magazines, one of the first questions you should ask yourself is, what kind of consciousness are they talking about? Because then you can better understand what they are trying to put forward as an idea. So that's very important.
Are mindfulness and consciousness different?
That's a good question. I think there are many misconceptions about that. Mindfulness has become a trendy word, a trendy expression to use. And for some people, it means everything and nothing. To keep it simple, mindfulness essentially, and you can read all you want on the internet about it, it's a technique. Essentially a technique of relaxation. That's basically what it is. It is aimed at reducing stress in people either who are hospitalized for cancer treatment or just find themselves stressed out and suffering anxiety. It's been clearly shown to be effective for those people if properly supervised medically. Consciousness is not a technique, it's a brain function, at least from a neuroscientist point of view. For other groups, such as, Buddhist monks, it would depend who you talk with. If you talk with religious groups or Jews or Christians, then they probably think it has nothing to do with the brain. But from a neuroscientific point of view, it's a brain function, and it's associated with activity specifically in networks that have been identified in the brain. So in that way, there are two really different things. Just to summarize, in the case of mindfulness, it's the technique of relaxation. In the case of consciousness, it's a brain function.
Okay. And so what's an example of how somebody would use mindfulness in therapy or in recovery from a medical circumstance or an injury, et cetera?
Well, the protocol is pretty much standard and relatively simple, not necessarily simple to use, but simple to understand. It's 45 minutes of meditation that is essentially composed of body scan techniques or breathing awareness techniques. And that gets your mind away from unconscious thoughts that may lead to stress for you. So it's a way to escape from all this turmoils in your head, right? And that leads to a relaxation. Just thinking about your breathing, just thinking about body scanning is essentially going from one group of muscles to another one. Thinking about tension in your muscle, the position of your muscle. Is it contracted? Is it not contracted? You can play with that also, contracting it or not. Essentially, you're focusing on things happening inside your body, but not inside your mind, right? So you're trying to be in connection with your sensations related with breathing or with proprioception, which is muscle activity.
So would it be fair to say that mindfulness is a way of alleviating fear, anxiety, stress, and uncertainty, let's say, about the past and the future, to try and alleviate the physiological effects of those thoughts?
Yeah, exactly. So stress caused by whatever happens in your head that is out of control, I mean by out of control, that is unconsciously occurring, and that leads to stress for you. You might have recurrent thoughts about, I don't know, being killed. If you don't put consciousness into that, you keep thinking about that thoughts all day long or regularly, and that leads to some stress, or that could be totally something else, like being afraid of being in contact with other people.
Which a lot of people are dealing with now with COVID.
Yeah, but for other reasons.
I think primarily of somebody with the example of, let's say, you know, you have a family and everything, and all of a sudden you're down with a serious illness, cancer, or whatever the situation is, then obviously you might end up in a spiral thinking about, oh, what if I would have done things differently? I did things I shouldn't have done in the past that didn't respect my health. What's going to happen to my family in the future? How is this going to affect me? Am I going to live? Am I going to die? So there's a lot of places for the mind to go, a lot of sort of spirals, negative spirals to go down for the mind. And so bringing ourselves back to the present and focusing on our body and solely that main function, I could see how that would help alleviate and relax the body.
Yeah, it gets your head away from those problems at least 45 minutes per day. You have to do, and that, well, it's funny to say, but 45 minutes per day away from those crazy thoughts, that's enough to reduce significantly stress and the effect of stress on your health, or even the effect of stress on the effectiveness of medication, because it's been originally developed by John Kabat-Zinn specifically for that, to improve the effects of therapy. Because people who are stressed out, who are constantly concerned by their conditions, they respond less properly or less efficiently to medications, to their treatment. So being more relaxed, practicing that technique is a good way for the effectiveness of some therapies, actually. So that was the original goal of Kabat-Zinn, was to help cancer patients with their conditions and making sure they would respond optimally in an optimal way to the chemotherapy, for instance.
So Pierre, are you saying that there's a generally accepted practice for for medical treatment to include a 45-minute daily mindfulness practice?
No, it doesn't look like that yet. Massachusetts University Medical Center is practicing it in some departments because that's where the mindfulness technique has been developed. Other than that, I think there's about 1,000 properly trained instructors to guide you through the learning and the practice of the mindfulness technique. So elsewhere, I mean, outside the US, and most of those trainers are in the US. So outside the US and outside the Boston area, I'm not sure it is that well accepted or used regularly. I doubt it, because there's not enough trained individuals for that.
So on the subject of reducing stress and anxiety, etc., what are the best forms of meditation or best practices for resetting your mind? And why don't we stick with that thought of doing 45-minute daily practice, right? And what would be the best way to utilize that 45 minutes, in your opinion, from a neurological point of view?
It depends what you're looking for. Up to now, we talked about mindfulness, and mindfulness is a technique of relaxation. So if your goal is to be more relaxed, just to be more relaxed, or to get some benefits on your health, then the MBSR technique that we often call the mindfulness technique, or the John Kabat-Zinn's technique, is the one, because at least it's been clearly shown to work, and there's no doubt about it. As I said, there are other studies that were done afterwards that showed it's not any better than anxiolytics or regular exercising or things like that, but it works.
What does the MBSR stand for? And I gather that's the mind-body scan and the breathing technique. Yeah.
So you can do one or the other, or switch in between the two. All those two techniques are part of the MBSR approach, which stands for mindfulness-based stress reduction approach. Simply. So that would be a method of choice to reduce stress. But if your goal is to increase a global rise of your awareness level of your consciousness, then maybe other methods would be better, at least, such as transcendental meditations. You know, those monks who use the that's so repeating this sound over long periods of time, according to them, helps someone reaching higher levels of consciousness. Otherwise, well, if you're interested in reducing stress or want to increase awareness levels, also you may look into a relatively new trend, or is something that is trendier more than ever. It's meditation through movements. So that comprises the Tai Chi, the yoga, Pilates. So you're improving your physical condition while doing some forms of meditation, at least. So you may get dual effects, because through exercise training, you can activate those brain areas that are associated with the expression of consciousness, the same way that some forms of meditation can do as well. So you're using two approaches, physical activity and meditation, to increase activities in those brain networks associated with consciousness expression. So that those methods are quite good as well. If you're someone extremely busy and your main problem with all those methods is to find that 45 minutes in your schedule, then we came up recently with a new method that is called the ICAL method, which stands from intermittent consciousness anytime, all day long. So you don't need to stop and undertake a meditation session. You simply put some consciousness into everything you do. So you can meditate and think about what you're doing while you're driving your car, listening to someone, talking to someone, washing dishes, etc. So that could be an interesting approach for people who are perhaps too busy to find the time to practice meditation on a regular basis with more traditional approaches.
Yeah, and this is something that you and I have talked about before, is the idea of just being conscious of what you're doing at the time, eating meditation. So being conscious of the food you're eating and what's going on around you, and walking meditation, being conscious of your surroundings, the sound, the wind, etc., bringing you into the present.
Yeah, and ultimately it goes way beyond that. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Starting with being conscious of what's going on in you, it's one thing that could start with breathing awareness, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg. If you think about it, being fully conscious, although I think it's utopic to think that it's reachable, but being fully conscious would mean being aware of what's going on everywhere in you, around you, well, close enough so that your senses can detect what's going on around you, but also way above that, using your knowledge, your memory of what we know about the universe, actually. So realizing, being aware that you're in a planet that is turning around the sun, that is a small part of a universe from which we know very little. We know there are 200 billion stars in our galaxy and 200 billion galaxies in the known universe. And some astrophysicists think that's only 1/10 of what there is left to know. Being aware of all that simultaneously with what's going on in you and close by to you, I think that's where it started being interesting. Put things in perspective.
Yeah, I was just going to use the word perspective, right? It's interesting. I've been listening to some podcasts called about Stoicism. The Daily Stoic is the podcast. Really interesting stuff. And I've never been one for Greek mythology, Roman Empire stuff. I just haven't paid attention to that in general. But it really puts things in perspective when you think about how long the Roman Empire was and how many people were of importance in that, like 3 or 4, something like that, right? So the thought that we're going to make a big mark on the world is really the minute.
Yeah. Knowing as much as we can about what's known, and that includes history.
Yeah.
That includes what the basic about astrophysics, about mathematics, about a number of different areas. I think that's essential to hope reaching a high consciousness level. So we often talk about awareness and consciousness and limits it to what's going on inside us, being in the present moment. But I think it goes way beyond that. It's when you look at things with different perspective and different angles and different lens power, then you see what's going on, or the truth as it is dans la réalité des choses. And
in the reality of it.
Yeah. Because we're often limits our interpretation or our vision of things to only our five senses. Oh, I see that motorbike coming by. It's making a lot of noise. It's aggressing. So you're only limiting your perspective to those immediate stimulations. But in the end, if you look at things differently, you may think that this is not significant. The sound you just heard is not significant. And you don't have to be annoyed for that. It doesn't make sense. But you have to constantly change lens and look at things with different perspectives.
We talked about monks and the high level with which monks practice consciousness and mindfulness, I guess. What have we learned from monks about meditation and consciousness?
Well, Buddhist monks in particular, they are really into increasing their level of compassion. That's again something else. But doing that, they practice meditation a lot, and that increases their level of consciousness. I think there's no doubt about that. There hasn't been that many clinical studies with monks, but there's been a few very interesting ones. And one of them that was published relatively recently showed that monks that have been practicing for a few decades, so that's more than 10,000 hours of meditation practice. If you take that group and a group of non-monks, of normal people who haven't been practicing meditation, you see that the brain of those monks have been able to retain a maximum of gray matter. I need to explain a number of things to make sense out of all this.
That'd be great.
When we get older, most people are aware that we're losing neurons, right? For the last 100 years, we've heard a lot that human beings after the age of 20 start losing 1% of their brain every year. That has been the subject of debate. And there's this one thing most scientists would agree about, not necessarily that there's this 1% loss of neurons per year after age 20, but there's definitely a reduction in brain size, specifically the gray matter over time. Because neurons are shrinking, there's less neurotransmitter for communication between neurons. So there are smaller dendrites. Dendrites are like the branches of a tree, okay? And the neuron would be somewhere in between, and the stem or the main part of the tree would be the axon. That's a anatomy crash course.
Sure, yeah.
So they agree that there's a significant reduction in the gray matter of our brain. And in the group of monks that is well experienced in meditation, there's a vast experience meditating, they found a significant difference. So they can keep up that gray matter volume more than normal people. That's one thing. It doesn't say much than that. It's interesting if you can keep your gray matter volume, so the size of your neurons as it was 10 years or 20 years earlier. It's a good news, but we don't know more about it. Something very interesting also that has been found recently, very recently, actually last year, they found that among those couple of networks that have been associated with consciousness expressions, such as the NCC, the DMN, the VAT, the DAT. They found out that for monks, they are able to remove that anti-correlated activity between the DMN and the DAT. I know it's a bit tricky, a bit complicated, but it means essentially that with practicing meditation for several years help you to get greater activity in brain areas that are important for consciousness. In comparison, normal people who have been practicing meditation for just a couple of months or a couple of years, they will get activity that can increase in one of those networks, and that will have as a consequence a reduction in another part of those networks underlying consciousness. So there's a constant battle between those networks. But for monks, that battle disappears.
Wow.
To find inner peace and serenity, of course, it doesn't help to be judgmental about everything that you're experiencing, sensing, and that includes thinking. I think most philosophers, meditation guru, or other experts agree on that. Being judgmental about what you're experiencing, what you're going through is not a good idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I wouldn't go as far as saying that it automatically creates stress, pain, and so on, but it's not. Yeah, it's generally not a good idea to be judgmental about what's happening. For instance, I went to the museum with my daughter this afternoon, and it's quite chilly in Belgium these days. It was 14 degrees and raining, as often in Belgium.
Yeah,
and
like our weather in Vancouver.
Yeah, and we got out of the museum. She said, "Oh, gee, it's so cool. It's raining. It's terrible." But I said, "It's just rain. It's you don't have to say it's terrible." Sometimes I try to add some perspective to what is going on and what she's saying. Hopefully, she one day she will understand that what I meant by that. But all this to say that that was an example where she was unnecessarily judgmental about what was happening. Rain is not a bad thing, a good thing. It's just rain, and you will dry your clothes after that. The fact that it's 14 degrees, it's not bad, or it's not painful, or so it's all your interpretation that makes it a bad thing or a good thing. So that's not necessary, and it leads you nowhere actually.
Well, and I think we're conditioned that way a lot.
Yeah,
so the media, for instance,
definitely.
We'll present the weather report and say, we're going to have some terribly cold weather. And depending what you're doing, I mean, if you're sailing, then the wind is a nice thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right? Everything is relative, yeah.
It is. So I find myself doing that with my partner and with other people at times, and as saying, hey, it's Mother Nature, Mother Nature's sending us a little water and a little wind, and, just feel it. It's alive, right?
Yeah. It's another type of stimulation. And I mean, if it's a stimulation that hurts you physically, really, like being burned by a fire or something like that's something else. But you don't have to be judgmental and to be mad against that fire. You're being burned. You can just realize it, and you do what you have to do to get out of the problem.
So Pierre, I told you I made a list of questions that were submitted by listeners, and I'm going to try and intersperse them in here when they make sense. So here's one that was from Wanda. Why are people so fearful?
If I refer myself to a number of leaders on that question, it's essentially because the ego, so the part of you, the part of us that is unconsciously driving our behaviors and our thoughts as well, the ego wants to survive no matter what. When you find a stressful situation that might put your life in danger or that might reduce your quality of life, then your ego is threatened. It's as if the ego always wants to stay away from death, stay away from problem, wants to feel good and be better than other people. So whenever you're encountering problems, the ego finds it stressful. About everything can be perceived and can be considered as a problem as far as the ego is concerned. So that's where the conscious part of your brain should ideally come into play as often as possible to counterbalance what the ego naturally wants from you, to be always better, to have always more money, to have a longer life, to all those sort of things.
So it's sort of an innate survival instinct, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
In a few words. Yeah.
My doctor, he's pretty philosophical and quite an interesting gentleman. He put it this way one time. He said, the mind is a problem-solving machine, he says. And if you don't have a problem, your mind will create one to work on.
Right. I would just add to that, that's the part of your mind associated with the ego. For me, the mind is any mental activities occurring in your brain. So it's very large. It includes the ego-mediated activities, so unconsciousness, and the non-ego related activities, so consciousness per se. So it's always a fight between the two. And that's why it's not that easy to be conscious. You always have your ego that tries to fight back and to gain over you for the next thought, the next behavior, etc.
And is that function, is that located in the reptilian brain or the limbic system, or is it
more and more we realize that there are a fair number of regions in the brain where unconsciousness and consciousness are expressed. It's really a collaboration and interactions between a number of areas that have been found also to be involved in other functions. But when they collaborate in a certain manner, that underlies mainly conscious behaviors or unconscious behaviors. There are parts of the thalamus that are involved, the amygdala, the hypothalamus. So there are a number of regions that have been studied for other reasons before, but like pretty much any area of the body or the brain and the spinal cord, each single areas or center or nucleus is not specifically associated with one function. It is often involved in different functions depending on how it's talking with other regions. Unfortunately, it's much more complex than we used to think, because if we go back 400 years ago, one of the first who thought that consciousness, but back then we used the word mainly soul, was Descartes, Jean-René Descartes in France. And he was among the first to propose that a region in the brain could be responsible for consciousness or for the expression of life itself and movement and all that. So it was the pineal gland that was one of the regions. Today, most of the researchers don't agree that it's an important area of the brain involved in consciousness expression, but it all started with his proposal that the brain was responsible for the soul. So the soul is no longer a term used by scientists or researchers, but back then it was one of the first word used to describe what may distinguish us from other form of life.
So what do they use instead of soul? What did they replace that with?
A few decades later, we started to use the word consciousness just a little bit, but it's mainly in the 20th centuries that researchers have used the word consciousness instead of soul. Of course, soul and spirit are still words that are used by some group of people, such as religious people, for instance. But more and more, there's a clear distinction being made between what could be a soul, if that exists. By the way, there's no reasonable evidence that a soul or a spirit exists. But we have, on the other hand, evidence that consciousness indeed exists and consciousness exists.
So what would you say is the difference between the soul and consciousness? Because I know you and I discussed this about 20 years ago. We had a discussion about the belief system and whether we have a soul and the body's energy. So what would you say is the difference between having a soul and experiencing consciousness?
I mean, the definition is different, because if we talk to a religious leader, to most religious leaders, they're going to say that the soul or the spirit is something immaterial, which is not the case with consciousness, something immaterial that survives death and lived in the afterlife. More or less, that's the main definition associated most of the time with soul and spirit. And that's something that drives life itself, therefore movement in a human body or in an animal as well, depending on who you're talking with. Some philosophers thinks that souls and spirits are only something related with humans, and other things it's all living organisms that have some form of soul and spirits. Like the native people used to think and still think that they are spirits in all living forms.
Right.
In trees and animals and human beings. So in one case, you are dealing with something that is non-material, immaterial, that is not tangible, is not, has no neurological basis. And with consciousness, you're dealing more with something that doesn't survive death, that doesn't live in the afterlife, and is totally attached to the body. It's part of the body. It's part of the brain.
So with a soul, there's nothing we can use to measure it and to see that it's tangible. And with consciousness, its actual activity, is it electrical activity?
Yes, it's electrical and neurochemical.
Yeah. Neurochemical, electric activity in our neurophysiology.
Yeah.
I'm a layperson.
That would be the best way to separate them in just a few words. Yeah.
So you mentioned a little while ago, you mentioned plants and the environment. And some people believe that there's a consciousness or some kind of activity there that I guess communicates, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was on vacation last week and we took a hike through the old growth forests on the West Coast. And my cousin was reading a book called I think it was called The Secret Life of Trees. And she was giving me a synopsis of it and explaining how the trees talk to each other and they make room for each other if they're growing and all this kind of stuff.
That's fascinating, yeah.
In your opinion, do trees and ecosystems have a consciousness that can be measured? I know it's not your specific area, but what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, of course, we would have to stretch our definition of consciousness, because the one we're using for human beings, as you just pointed out, is essentially associated with the amount of electrical activities in some parts of the brains, the amount of neurochemical release and all that in some parts of the brains, and that can be measured quantitatively. Of course, trees have no brain, so that's a bad start if you want to make comparison.
You can't measure the brain if it's not there, right?
If you're willing to accept that consciousness can come in different forms and can be expressed in different ways, I would go as far as saying that, yeah, it makes sense to think that all living organisms have some form of consciousness that we are not ready to understand. We're not quite there yet. We're struggling enough just with trying to understand what consciousness is for a human. If trees along the years have been able to develop a communication system with the roots, enabling them to alert some of their neighbors when there are bacteria, mushrooms, or viruses that could impact their survival. I mean, to me, it blows my mind. It's just fantastic. So I think it's just the tip of the iceberg to what we will learn in the next decades about, first of all, about forms of communication between trees and other plants. And eventually that may lead to other findings for that biological system, but also about animals. That's going to be very interesting. There's a lot of interest about what consciousness means in animals, especially for research in animals. So what's ethical? What can we do to animals that it's acceptable to move forward in finding new medicines for human beings? So what's the relation between pain, consciousness, ethical research, and all that? There's a whole area and a bunch of researchers that are asking themselves those questions. They're a little bit different than the questions we're talking about today, but it's another form of consciousness that some researchers are already looking into to help accepting research projects to move forward, despite the fact that sometimes there may be some pain associated with some techniques and all that.
So going back to the book, do you want to tell us about some of the experiences in the book?
After 2 episodes of cancer, I realized that it didn't make any sense anymore for me to live my life the way I was living it, essentially with very little consciousness in it. I found myself very aggressive with people, but otherwise I had many struggles with social relations, being mad very often for no particular reasons. And overall, just being sad, deep down inside. And that came from a number of incidents, some of which had more effect than others on me. For instance, I describe in the book that when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I was almost thrown in front of a train at a metro station in Montreal by a bunch of boys that were just a few years older than me, whom I didn't know at all. They just showed up and wanted to see what could that do to throw someone in front of a train. Of course, that created a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety for many years afterwards. In fact, I didn't even remember. That was erased from my memory unconsciously for about 30 years. And that came back to me slowly several decades later. Later on, also, I was almost killed during my first trip in South America. I bumped into a bunch of guys who had guns, were either drunk or stoned. I wanted to solve a problem in between them and a client of mine. I was organizing that group for traveling in South America. So that was another quite stressful, I would say, event that led to additional fear of other human beings. What else? I've had a few near fatal accidents during a road trip across the US. Also during trips in Germany where highways have no speed limits. I was driving nearly at 180, 200 kilometers per hour. And of course, I was not driving a Ferrari that could very well handle that kind of speed, but I had a small Hyundai with cheap tires. So when I think about it, those tires could have blown away anytime.
That was a different trip than the one we took.
Yeah, it was a different one. I was a safe driver with you.
Because I remember I was driving. It was a Hyundai of some kind, and I remember I was enjoying driving down the highway there. I think it was even a bit of a construction zone, and I was going through at about 180 kilometers an hour or something like that.
I forgot about that episode.
Well, I just remember you kind of saying, "Bernie, would you mind slowing down a little bit?"
There's a bunch of episodes like that I've been through in my life that further created stress, anxiety, that led to psychological pain and to social dysfunctions, I think, in my life. And automatically you're being driven away from happiness, from inner peace, from serenity, if you're in that kind of a fear mode all the time. So I was getting to a point where most human beings for me were a threat. I never knew where the next threat would come from. And sometimes the threat would come from me when driving a car at 200 kilometers per hour on the road. I mean, it's almost a suicidal act. Unconsciously, again, I never wanted to suicide myself. Retrospectively, when I think about all that, it was a profound psychological pain that led to all those behaviors. I was not continuously expressing those problems actually with very, very good friends. I was feeling that I was surrounded by good people.
Right.
But for me, those good people were like the 5 fingers of my hands. I had no more friends than 3 or 4 people. So in other moments in my life, or when I would go to work, or I would be in public transportation, or all sorts of circumstances, I would always be on my guard, ready to attack or defend myself, stressed out, ready to snap at any moment. And all those behaviors and reactions were totally out of control for me. They were all reflexes. So it's much later on that I realized that they were all reflexes because my rational brain, my non-ego part of my mental activities were almost never present. We're never taking the place it deserves. So I was a reflex machine.
Yeah.
And my thoughts were influenced, my reactions, my emotions, all those things are controlled by mental activities. So if all that mental activity is driven by ego-driven motivations or control, I was reacting to the pain I went through, my lack of trust towards human beings, my fear of human beings and all that. And then it's just a reflex machine.
And so how does neuroscience fit into that? And I mean, again, we all have fears to varying degrees, let's say. How does neurophysiology fit into that phenomenon and also dealing with that phenomenon?
As we said very early on, we are still struggling at identifying what consciousness is. And neuroscientists are just beginning to investigate some of the activities in the brain that could be associated with consciousness. Where science has led to some progress is essentially behavioral neuroscience. So there's been a number of techniques, approaches that have been developed that we found can reduce stress, can reduce anxiety. So we know the impact of meditation on the reduction of stress and anxiety. That is essentially data and findings from behavioral neuroscience. So, but at the core of what the mechanisms are, we're still in the dark, truly, unfortunately. So we know that there's a number of centers in the brain, such as the DAT area. It's a number of areas in the brain, including the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, that are activated particularly, but not only for that, but are particularly activated when we are aware of our environment.
Okay.
And there are other areas like that in the brain that are particularly activated when we are, for instance, more focused on what's going on inside ourselves, such as during most of the meditation approaches, such as the MBSR approach developed by Kabat-Zinn, that essentially consists in focusing on your breathing activity or every part of your body. And there's another set of neurons in the brain that are activated for that.
So in the book, when you dissect and deconstruct the idea of having fear and in these experiences from a neuroscience point of view, what can people who are reading the book gain from that?
Well, in the end, I'm trying to develop the idea that to reduce stress, to reduce anxiety, to reduce psychological pain, you have to increase your level of consciousness. One way to do it is standard meditation approaches. However, those meditation approaches are difficult, I would say, to practice on a regular basis. What I propose is a little bit like, you remember that publicity from Nike, just do it. If you want to be more conscious, just do it.
Right.
So it has to be anytime, all day round. So
yes.
Every behaviors that we have, every thoughts that we have, every emotion that we have is an opportunity to be conscious about it, to be more conscious. Mm-hmm. So of course, we cannot expect within 24 hours to be conscious of everything we say, everything we think, everything we do. But it should be a goal that we have to practice meditation through movement, through everything we do, by opposition to practicing meditation to increase consciousness only once a day if you're a pro, like the Dalai Lama. But for most people, they just can't do it. They just find the time, 45 minutes per day to do it. And most people I've talked with, actually all people I've talked with, are not able to think about their breathing properly more than 1 or 2 minutes. For most methods of meditation, to get started, they ask you to be aware of your breathing during 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, which is a reason of failure for me, for most people. So instead of focusing on breathing, which is just the tip of the iceberg of what consciousness is, we should just do it. When we're talking, we should be conscious about what we're saying, why we're saying it, the reaction of the person, the emotion it creates in us. We have to be aware of our body positioning when we're walking. We have to be in the here and now as often as we can. I think that's the take-home message I wanted to share with that book.
Yeah, so you're emphasizing the importance of being conscious, being in the moment, and developing that practice on a regular basis. And are you giving some tips on how to do that? Because for myself, for instance, I studied martial arts at different times in my life. And so there was a certain amount of meditation in there and focusing on your breathing and delivering power and those sorts of things. So for decades, I've had this sort of off and on practice of meditating or consciousness. But now sometimes I remember to be conscious when I'm walking and I look at the trees and I absorb everything around me and forget about the future and the past, right? Think about my breathing, and I actually do think about how my legs are working and those sorts of things. Or I'll do the same thing with the eating meditation, where I'll make sure that I'm really focused on the flavors and how the food was prepared and all that sort of items to be conscious of. But for the most part, I forget about it. Maybe I'll be waiting for an elevator and I'll think, okay, I've got 30 seconds here. So rather than get stressed out about the elevator, I'm going to just focus on my breathing and my posture and stuff.
That's exactly, I think you're explaining it perfectly. The problem is to do it as often as we can, because we forget about it and the ego takes over very rapidly because it's a reflex. It's easier to let the ego run the show than consciousness to run the show. So that's where training gets into play. Instead of using meditation as a training, 45 minutes, 3 times per week only for those who are goods, 5 times for pros, and only once a year for most people, that won't do it. You won't increase consciousness this way. I think it's intuitive to realize that. So that's why we need to transform our understanding of the word meditation, and to understand that meditation is anything that any mental activity that we have that puts some consciousness into our sensation, or into our behaviors, into our reactions. And for that, you need knowledge. You need to know things that are known. There are many things that are don't yet known in the world, but there are a number of things that are known about the astrophysics. It's important to know what's surrounding us outside planet Earth, because that may de-dramatize a number of things that happen to us that may create emotions that are not necessarily good for our inner peace, for our joy. It put things in perspective, to see things at different scale. So we need to know what's going on at a larger scale, at our own scale, and even sometimes think and meditate about what may be the life of this insect passing by us. And that's part of life as well. That's beautiful. And being in awe in front of all these expressions of life is another way to find a peaceful state of mind.
What would you suggest is a good way of reminding ourselves? Personally, I'm thinking if I schedule, say, maybe to start off 10 minutes, 3 times a week, or maybe or go on to, an hour, 5 times a week, whatever it is, but schedule some time. And then at the same time, when I see other opportunities, if I'm in the reception area of an appointment I'm waiting for example, then there's other opportunities to develop that habit as well of being more conscious.
Frankly, I don't know. I guess it may be different from one person to another, but I think one of the keys is motivation. If you're motivated to change, then you'll just be motivated to train at putting consciousness into everything you do and everything you feel.
Right.
So it's mainly about changing your mindset and putting things in perspective and realizing that that's probably the most important thing you can try to achieve in your life, is to increase your consciousness level, because everything depends on that. Otherwise, you'll be the victim of your ego, which will continuously perpetuate your pain, your stress, your anxiety, stress of the future, stress of losing your job and all that.
Yeah.
But if you are putting consciousness into that and changing perspectives one way or another on things that happen to you, that will just fade away. Normally with time, over time. So it's a question of doing it as often as we can. Of course, if something emergency happen, you have 2, 3, 4 kids at home, and there's one is crying for this thing and the other one is asking you to, then of course you're in the action reaction type of mode, and you're more into the reflex mode. But as soon as you can, even washing dishes, cleaning the floor, those are all activities that could seem boring, but if you put consciousness into it, well, it becomes an activity like any other. And if you're doing it, it's because there's a reason. You chose to do it because you like to clean a house. And so you should be happy about it.
Well, even if you have a mundane job or a mundane practice, like personally, I'm into swimming these days. I do a lot of swimming these days. And I'm constantly conscious when I'm swimming. Probably about 50% of the time at least, I'm focused on how I can get more movement for my effort, how I can swim more efficiently, how I could breathe more efficiently. So I find that to be very therapeutic. For whatever it is, I swim for about 30 or 40 minutes. So for that time, I'm very focused on all those aspects, and I'm forgetting about everything else. Much like when I was sailing a lot more, my sailing mentor said that sailing is 95% boredom and 5% sheer terror. And to a certain degree, that's right. What I would say about sailing is that it taught me to be patient, because when you're out in the ocean and there's no wind, here we're in a sheltered part of the ocean. So sometimes there's no wind, the boat's not moving.
That's
so
terrible.
You have to sit and wait, right? So it teaches you to be patient. Yeah. Then the wind comes along and there's a lot of wind, and you have to be running around the boat, adjusting sails, attacking, avoiding other boats, right?
It's exciting. It's stressing, but not the psychological stress we were talking about.
Well, once you know what you're doing as a sailor, even before that, it's taking all of your faculties. It's a survival thing.
Yeah.
Right? Because the wind's blowing, that you have to make sure you don't hurt the people in the boat. The boom can come around, hit somebody in the head. So you're in charge of 3 or 4 passengers, let's say, and then you're also in charge of the boat and maintaining traffic. And so for that given amount of time, you are totally unaware of anything else except for the moment is where you're in, right? During that time, it's a survival thing.
Yep.
Right. And I'm not thinking, okay, I'm breathing and I'm enjoying the weather. I'm thinking, okay, how do I avoid hitting that rock? How do I keep the passengers safe? This sort of thing. So I would argue, if I can, that in those times, it's beneficial and probably really healthy to get out of your own head sometimes.
I agree. It's almost, it's not an emergency situation, but you're in a small moment of crisis where things could turn bad.
Yeah.
You have to be, in the moment, in the action. And I agree with you, that would be very complicated to start adding a layer of mental activity to be conscious of what's going on, of everything's going. There are so many things, the wind against your cheek, the next step you have to make to either to turn left or right to make sure nobody's falling in the water. But this being said, I agree with you. There are plenty of moments like that in our daily lives. But as soon as we're out of those moments, we can, if we want to, be conscious again about what we're thinking, how we're moving.
It's almost a sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system type of comparison, isn't it?
The sympathetic, during that particular moment you were just describing. But no, the parasympathetic system is not, I don't know if that you were leading to that. The parasympathetic system is not responsible for consciousness expression.
Oh, it's not?
No, because the sympathetic system activated during a situation like that is not the same as the sympathetic system in the brain and the spinal cord. We have two sympathetic and parasympathetic systems.
Oh.
And those controlling muscles, heartbeat, breathing rate, and all that, those are the peripheral sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, which is not to be mixed and associated with the ones that exist in our brain and spinal cord, because we have noradrenaline in our brain and spinal cord, but they're not associated with those motor behaviors or extreme case scenarios. The same chemical can be used for very different tasks in the body, whether depending on its localization in the brain or the body. Like there's dopamine in the brain, but there's some dopamine also in peripheral organs. They don't have the same mission at all. So it was simpler for our body to come up with a limited number of drugs, of molecules, but to assign them different functions depending on where they are located and which cells they are in connection with. So it was, I guess, a wise thing to do instead of trying to develop a chemical or neurochemical for everything that is happening in our nervous system or body. We would have a long list of chemicals floating around.
How many chemicals do we have now? Is there a number?
Good question. You mean in the brain?
Yeah.
Oof. There are about 10 classical neurotransmitters that have been known for several decades, but now we're finding new ones almost every year, but they are not anymore called classical neurotransmitters, but they are neurochemicals that contribute to neural communications in between neurons.
And these would be things like dopamine.
So that's one example where when I was saying that they're just a limit, we're still very ignorant about almost gross anatomy, because I classified that as gross anatomy of our body. We still don't know all the chemicals that are used, and because for each neurochemical, it will be metabolized by the body and gets into another form of chemical. Now we're finding that that other form of chemical that we thought for a long time that was just a waste byproduct, no, it has a function as well. And that byproduct is degraded, is metabolized again in something else, another chemical. And that's a third level of degradation as also a function in our bodies. We're getting into a never-ending story.
So some of those substances or chemicals, I guess, would include potassium and calcium. Is that right?
Those are not neurochemicals. They are used by the neurons for generating electric potential and action potential for the communication between neurons.
Right.
The neuron is like a battery. There's a gradient of ions on one side and of other types of ions on the other side. That creates an electric potential.
Positive, negative.
And then when there's an unbalance in that stable potential, that creates an action potential, which is the end product for communication between neurons. Right? It would be easier for me to explain in French, but
I'm sure
that's the best I could do.
That's all right. If there's a French word that you need translated, as long as it's not too scientific, I could probably help you.
Okay.
So that leads me to the question: how important or beneficial is nutrition to the functioning of the brain and the nervous system? Because a lot of those things you're talking about, right, are found in nutrition too. You know, when you talk about potassium and calcium and
yeah, it's important, of course. And as most people know, we cannot survive much if we don't drink for 3 or 4 days, and we probably and we will have a hard time surviving if we don't eat between 10 and 20 days, depending on the person. So in the food, you'll get, of course, minerals that are essential, like the potassium, the sodium, the calcium, are essential for many cells in the body, but essentially for neurons, for creating that potential we were talking about. But as far as being maniac about nutrition, thinking that it rules everything, the body can transform many things. Like if you think about it, a cow is, huge and filled with skeletal muscles. It's impressive, but they don't eat meat. They eat grass.
Yeah.
So the body can transform veggies into muscles if he has to. Of course, the body won't create calcium or essential elements like that, but I think there could be many ways to eat and many diets that could be appropriate without impairing neural function significantly. I wouldn't be maniac about that and thinking that, I have to be very, very careful about what I eat to be more conscious.
Right.
No, I wouldn't go that far. No.
So you would select your diet more for other things than for brain function, neurofunction. So you would select your diet.
Well, it goes hand in hand. If you have a brain that functions normally or efficiently, you have to have a body that works normally and efficiently. So you have to have a balanced lifestyle. If you eat only once a day or once every second day, if you eat only chips and mashed potatoes, of course, that won't do it. Your body will eventually suffer. You'll have carences, and your brain will have also problems eventually. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what's going to happen. But the brain is not disconnected from the rest of the body. It's part of the body. If you suffer of muscle wasting and osteoporosis, not because of age, but because of a nutrition problem, your brain will have consequences for sure.
Okay.
But I wouldn't be able to pinpoint exactly what would happen, because it would probably depend from one person to another, and it's not something that is that studied in detail right now. But the brain and the rest of the body are not separate things. They work hand in hand. And what we eat affects all of our cells, not equally, but the brain cannot work perfectly if the body suffers of carences and malnutrition and lack of water even. The top trainer of Olympic athletes in the world, he used to say that caviar was the meal of choice for the activity of your neurons, but equally for the activity of your skeletal muscle cells. So for him, whenever he had a chance, he ate caviar. Okay. This being said, I would say it's more important not to lose too much money on caviar, but to be careful in having a balanced diet, as you said.
Yeah,
eating a little bit of everything.
You'd want to balance it out with champagne, right?
Exactly. And good red wine. Yeah, I think balance is the key. Not being excessive in anything, not having a focus on a particular food or a group of foods, but having a balanced diet and trying to eat as many things as possible, different things.
So it sounds like the takeaway is eat for your body, not for your brain.
Yeah, because it's the same thing, actually.
Yeah, it's connected.
It's totally connected.
What's good for your body will be good for your brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need to find what makes your body happy in terms of level of energy, and that will be communicated, will be transferred to your brain also, which will increase its capabilities and increase also perhaps your will to get into a new mindset for personal growth and increase of consciousness levels, which needs some motivation, which needs some efforts.
Needs focused time, right?
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's difficult, but you need to think about it. You need to want it. You need to do it. I often think about this thing the Dalai Lama said one day. The guy practices meditation 5 or 6 hours a day, 365 days per year. So I would call it a pro. Okay. And even him, once in a while, he gets mad, meaning that he's not conscious anymore, simply when some of his employees don't do their job correctly.
Right.
So can you imagine thinking that we can reach really high level of consciousness all the time is utopic. And that, I think, is a good example. I mean, the guy is the pro of the pros.
Yeah.
And he can do it all the time. I think the best thing we can do for ourselves and not set too high standards, thinking that, oh, gee, I have not achieved it today. I was not conscious. Oh, don't blame yourself and do it 1 second at a time when you can. And if you're motivated, that training background will lead to something significant. I think you can get benefits from practicing that form of medication through movement or in the action or in the moment. You can get benefits very rapidly, but to get highly significant benefits may take months or years, and perfection doesn't exist.
Yeah, I would think that something like Tai Chi or yoga would be a great place to start. It's like most things, you don't want to go into the full ocean in a sailboat until you've learned how to at least leave the dock.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Yeah.
So,
my recommendation would be the easiest way to start is with walking, exactly like you described.
Right.
Walking has the advantage over other meditation approach, or being conscious of your muscles being contracted while you're walking, your body positioning, the wind on your cheek while you're walking, sounds around you while you're walking, all the stimulation you can get from your body and from around your body is the best way to start, because you will never fall asleep when you're walking, which is not the case where you're into the lotus position, for instance. For many meditation approaches, they propose to be in a comfortable position. The lotus position is sometimes a comfortable position for some people. But the problem is most of the time you fall asleep because you're not moving. If you want to be stimulated, have a higher level of mental activity and physical activity, well, you have to move. And that's, I think, the best approach for practicing meditation. It's when you're moving.
Building on that, I think meditation could be used as a way to go to sleep, right? So sometimes if I wake up in the middle of the night and I can't get back to sleep, I'll try and focus on nothing but taking 20 breaths. And I usually fall asleep around 7 or 12. Yeah.
Like I was saying, it's very tough for most people to be conscious of their breathing for more than 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah, it is for sure. Well, thanks again for joining me and for taking the time to do this.
It was great talking with you, Bernie, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay, sounds great, Pierre. Say hi to the family, and we'll talk.
Thanks. Okay. Bye, Bernie.
Ciao.
Please check the show notes for links and details about Dr. Pierre's book, 8th Chance at Enlightened Living for a Regular Guy. And that concludes this Bernie Chats. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe, like, share, and feel free to comment. Thank you for supporting the channel. I look forward to seeing you on the next Bernie Chats.